Somewhere in the quiet hours after their withdrawal began, a thought likely crept in and refused to leave. A thought insisting that something about you simply stopped being enough, that the spark faded, that attraction quietly died somewhere between the good months and the confusing ones. I need you to release that thought right now, because it is almost certainly wrong, and today we are going to walk through the actual mechanism behind their pulling away. A mechanism that has remarkably little to do with how attracted they were to you, and remarkably everything to do with something considerably deeper, something that would have activated with almost anyone who got close enough to trigger it. Let's begin by dismantling the attraction narrative directly, because this narrative causes an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering for people who deserve considerably more accurate understanding of what actually happened. Attraction and attachment operate through entirely different systems within the brain, systems that can and often do move independently of each other. Someone can remain genuinely, powerfully attracted to a partner while simultaneously experiencing intense internal pressure to create distance, because the withdrawal mechanism activates not in response to reduced desire, but in response to increased closeness itself. This distinction matters enormously, because it means the timing of their withdrawal, often occurring right as things felt closest and warmest, was never a coincidence pointing toward fading interest. It was, more likely, direct evidence that closeness itself had become the trigger. Let's talk about what actually happens neurologically and psychologically when closeness intensifies for someone with significant avoidant patterns, because understanding this mechanism replaces confusion with genuine clarity. As emotional intimacy deepens, certain avoidant nervous systems begin registering something considerably different than comfort or pleasure. They begin registering threat, an old, deeply conditioned alarm system activating in response to vulnerability, activating regardless of how genuinely safe the actual relationship happens to be. This alarm does not require conscious awareness in order to operate. It functions largely automatically, producing a felt sense of suffocation or unease that gets attributed, often incorrectly, to something being wrong with the relationship itself, when the actual source lies considerably deeper within their own formative history. Let's talk about where this alarm system typically originates, because tracing its roots clarifies why it has nothing genuinely to do with your specific qualities or your specific behavior. This pattern usually develops during early childhood, often through experiences where emotional needs were met inconsistently, where vulnerability was punished rather than comforted, where closeness with a primary caregiver felt unpredictable or even dangerous. A child navigating this kind of environment learns, out of genuine necessity for psychological survival, to associate emotional closeness with eventual disappointment or eventual engulfment. This learned association does not simply dissolve upon reaching adulthood. It continues operating beneath conscious awareness, shaping adult relationships in ways that feel, from the inside, like simple personal preference rather than deeply conditioned defensive pattern. Let's talk about why this pattern activates specifically during moments of increasing closeness rather than during moments of conflict or distance, because this timing often confuses people who assume relational difficulty should logically coincide with disagreement rather than with connection. The alarm system being described here responds to intimacy itself, not to problems within the relationship. This means the deepest, warmest, most vulnerable moments, the ones that most relationships would consider evidence of genuine success, become, paradoxically, the exact moments most likely to trigger withdrawal within avoidant psychology. Their pulling away following a particularly close or vulnerable exchange was not a delayed reaction to something going wrong. It was often a direct, immediate response to something going remarkably right. Let's talk about what this means specifically regarding your own role within this entire dynamic, because clarity here matters enormously for your own healing and your own self-understanding moving forward. You did not become less attractive by being genuinely close to them. You did not do anything wrong by allowing intimacy to deepen naturally. The withdrawal that followed reflects their own internal architecture, built long before you arrived, activated by the depth of connection itself rather than by any flaw or diminishment in your own desirability or your own worth as a partner. Let's talk about the specific confusion this mechanism creates, because understanding this confusion helps explain why so many people mistakenly conclude that attraction faded, rather than recognizing the genuine underlying pattern. Withdrawal driven by this internal alarm often gets rationalized, consciously, through explanations that focus on external, surface level factors, a partner seeming too intense, too needy, too available. Explanations that feel logical in the moment, but actually represent post hoc justification for a retreat whose real cause lies considerably deeper. This rationalization process happens partly because acknowledging the true source, genuine fear of closeness itself, requires a level of vulnerable self awareness that many people with significant avoidant patterns have not yet developed or have not yet felt safe enough to access. Let's talk about what typically happens to genuine physical and romantic attraction throughout this entire process, because attraction itself frequently remains completely intact even while withdrawal proceeds. Many people report once genuine reflection or genuine communication eventually occurs, that their avoidant partner continued finding them just as physically and romantically appealing throughout the entire period of withdrawal. The pulling away representing an entirely separate process running parallel to, rather than replacing, genuine ongoing attraction. This parallel operation explains why avoidant withdrawal so often gets followed by renewed interest once sufficient distance has restored a felt sense of safety. Interest that would make little sense if attraction had genuinely faded during the withdrawal period. Let's talk about the specific difference between wanting someone and being able to tolerate the vulnerability that sustained closeness with that person requires. Because this distinction explains the apparent contradiction at the heart of avoidant withdrawal. Someone can want you intensely, genuinely, consistently, while simultaneously lacking, at least currently, sufficient capacity to tolerate the sustained vulnerability that maintaining closeness with you over time actually requires. Wanting and capacity are not the same thing, and confusing them leads directly toward the painful, inaccurate conclusion that withdrawal indicates diminished desire, rather than what it actually indicates, a mismatch between genuine desire and currently available emotional capacity. Let's talk about what specifically triggers this capacity to become overwhelmed, because certain moments tend to activate this mismatch more powerfully than others. Genuine emotional vulnerability, sharing something difficult or something deeply personal, often triggers significant activation. Increasing routine and predictability within the relationship, the kind that signals genuine long term commitment rather than casual involvement, frequently triggers activation as well, precisely because permanence itself represents the ultimate closeness their system has learned to fear. Even positive milestones, meeting important people in each other's lives, discussing future plans together, can trigger this same activation, since these moments represent increasing depth, regardless of how positively intended or how genuinely desired they might consciously be. Let's talk about what it means to hold this understanding without using it to excuse behavior that genuinely caused you harm, because compassion for the origin of a pattern does not require accepting indefinite exposure to its ongoing impact. Understanding that their withdrawal stemmed from deep, conditioned fear rather than from diminished attraction toward you specifically offers genuine, valuable clarity, protecting your own self-worth from unnecessary erosion. This understanding does not simultaneously obligate you to continue tolerating repeated withdrawal without boundaries, without accountability, without evidence of genuine effort toward addressing the pattern directly. Let's talk about what genuine repair would actually require from someone whose withdrawal stems from this particular mechanism. Repair considerably more substantial than simply returning once distance has restored their felt sense of safety. Genuine repair requires developing actual awareness of this pattern, ideally through honest self-reflection or through professional support. Recognizing consciously when the alarm activates and learning to tolerate its discomfort without immediately acting on the urge toward retreat. It requires direct communication about this internal experience, rather than continued reliance on unconscious withdrawal followed by unexplained return. It requires sustained practice over considerable time, of remaining present during moments that previously would have triggered automatic distance. Let's talk about what your own healing specifically requires, given accurate understanding of why this withdrawal actually occurred. Your healing requires releasing the specific, painful narrative that you somehow became less desirable or less worthy of sustained closeness, replacing that narrative with accurate understanding that their withdrawal reflected their own internal architecture, rather than any genuine deficiency in your own value or your own appeal. It requires distinguishing clearly between compassion for the origin of their pattern and continued tolerance of its ongoing impact, without corresponding accountability or corresponding change. Let's talk about a specific pattern many people report noticing only in retrospect: the way small, seemingly insignificant moments of genuine warmth often preceded withdrawal by only a short window, sometimes mere days. A particularly tender conversation, a moment of unexpected laughter shared over something deeply personal, a small gesture of physical affection offered without prompting. These moments, celebrated in most relationships as evidence of deepening connection, frequently appear upon honest reflection to have directly preceded episodes of distance within avoidant dynamics specifically. Recognizing this pattern retrospectively often produces a strange mixture of relief and grief. Relief at finally understanding the actual mechanism. Grief at recognizing how many genuinely beautiful moments got misinterpreted as somehow causing the very withdrawal that actually followed them. Let's talk about why this retrospective recognition matters so significantly for your own ongoing healing. Because it fundamentally reframes moments you may have spent considerable time scrutinizing for evidence of what went wrong. Rather than searching those tender moments for some hidden flaw, some subtle misstep that supposedly triggered their retreat, understanding the actual mechanism allows you to hold those same moments as genuinely beautiful, genuinely valid evidence of real connection, entirely separate from whatever happened afterward. The warmth was real. The connection was real. What followed reflects their own internal architecture, not any inadequacy within the connection itself. Let's talk about the specific physiological experience many avoidant individuals report during these triggering moments of closeness, when eventually they develop enough self-awareness to articulate what actually occurs internally. Descriptions often include a sudden tightness in the chest, a felt need to create physical distance immediately, an almost claustrophobic sensation, despite nothing physically restrictive actually being present. This physiological response operates largely independent of conscious thought, meaning the withdrawal that follows often surprises the avoidant person nearly as much as it confuses their partner, arising from a bodily alarm rather than from any deliberate reasoned decision that attraction has somehow diminished. Let's talk about what this physiological reality means for how quickly withdrawal tends to follow triggering moments of intimacy, because the speed itself often provides additional evidence supporting this entire framework. Genuine loss of attraction typically develops gradually, accumulating through repeated negative experiences or repeated incompatibility over considerable time. The withdrawal being described throughout this discussion, by contrast, often arrives with startling speed, sometimes within hours of a particularly close or vulnerable moment, a timeline consistent with an automatic alarm response, rather than with any gradual, considered reassessment of genuine romantic interest. Let's talk about what happens specifically to attraction and desire during the withdrawal period itself, because this often provides some of the clearest evidence available regarding what actually drove the retreat. Many avoidant individuals report continued, sometimes even intensified romantic and sexual thoughts about their partner throughout periods of behavioral withdrawal, a pattern that would make little sense if genuine attraction had actually faded. This continued internal desire, existing alongside behavioral distance, reflects precisely the parallel processes discussed earlier. Genuine want persisting even while capacity for tolerating closeness temporarily diminishes. Let's talk about what specific evidence, beyond simply this general psychological framework, might help you personally distinguish between withdrawal driven by this closeness-related fear and withdrawal that genuinely does reflect diminished interest or diminished compatibility. Consider whether their withdrawal consistently followed moments of increased vulnerability or increased intimacy, rather than following disagreements or genuine incompatibility. Consider whether physical or romantic interest remained evident during less emotionally intense moments, even while emotional distance persisted. Consider whether their eventual return, if it occurred, arrived with continued warmth and continued desire, rather than with genuine indifference. These patterns, taken together, offer considerably more reliable evidence than simply assuming the worst interpretation by default. Let's talk about what this understanding should specifically change about how you interpret similar patterns in future relationships, should you encounter someone exhibiting comparable avoidant tendencies. Recognizing this mechanism early, understanding that withdrawal following genuine intimacy likely reflects internal fear rather than external judgment about your worth, protects you from repeating the same painful, inaccurate self-blame in future circumstances. This recognition does not obligate you to remain within any particular relationship indefinitely, but it does protect your own self-esteem from unnecessary erosion, regardless of which relationship you eventually find yourself navigating this particular pattern within. Let's talk about a specific misconception worth addressing directly: the belief that if attraction genuinely remained intact throughout their withdrawal, this somehow means the relationship could have been saved simply through patience, or through waiting long enough for the fear to resolve on its own. This misconception deserves careful correction, because continued attraction alongside continued withdrawal does not automatically translate into eventual sustainable closeness without considerable internal work occurring on their end specifically. Attraction persisting through withdrawal explains the confusing nature of the pattern, but it does not by itself resolve the underlying fear driving that withdrawal. Fear that typically requires active, deliberate effort to address, rather than resolving automatically through simple passage of time. Let's talk about what genuine internal work addressing this specific fear actually tends to involve. Work considerably more demanding than simply willing oneself to stay present during triggering moments. This typically requires developing genuine awareness of the physiological signals preceding withdrawal, learning to notice the tightness, the felt need for distance, before it translates automatically into behavioral retreat. It requires developing tolerance for these physiological signals without immediately acting on them, a skill that often benefits considerably from professional therapeutic support, given how deeply conditioned this particular response typically proves to be. It requires, eventually, developing genuine capacity to communicate the internal experience directly, saying honestly that closeness feels overwhelming in this particular moment, rather than relying on unconscious withdrawal as the only available coping mechanism. Let's talk about what it means for you personally to witness genuine evidence of this internal work occurring. Evidence worth distinguishing clearly from simply continued attraction or continued desire to remain connected. Genuine internal work looks like increasing self-awareness articulated directly, moments where they proactively name their own discomfort rather than simply disappearing without explanation. It looks like gradually increasing tolerance for sustained closeness, evidenced through longer periods without triggered withdrawal following vulnerable or intimate moments. It looks like genuine curiosity about their own patterns rather than continued defensive dismissal whenever those patterns get gently named or questioned. Let's talk about what remains true if this genuine internal work never develops, despite continued attraction persisting throughout the relationship's entire history. Continued attraction alone, without corresponding internal work addressing the underlying fear of closeness, typically produces an indefinitely repeating cycle. Closeness triggering withdrawal, distance restoring safety, renewed closeness triggering renewed withdrawal. A pattern that can persist for years without ever resolving into the sustained, secure intimacy genuine partnership actually requires. Recognizing this possibility protects you from indefinite patience, extended based purely on continued evidence of attraction. Evidence that, while genuinely meaningful, does not by itself guarantee the deeper transformation actually required for lasting change. Let's talk about what self compassion looks like specifically for you throughout this entire process of understanding. Compassion directed toward the earlier version of yourself who may have spent considerable time believing the painful, inaccurate narrative about diminished attraction or diminished worth. That earlier version of yourself was doing the best possible interpretation available given the confusing, contradictory information the situation actually provided: warmth followed by distance, closeness followed by retreat, patterns that would confuse almost anyone lacking the specific psychological understanding now available to you. Speaking to that earlier self with genuine kindness, rather than embarrassment at having believed the more painful interpretation for as long as you did, represents an important part of fully integrating this entire understanding. Let's talk about what this understanding ultimately offers you moving forward, regardless of whether this specific relationship eventually resolves toward genuine repair or toward genuine ending. It offers accurate self-perception, protected from the corrosive, inaccurate belief that your own worth or your own desirability caused someone else's retreat from genuine intimacy. It offers considerably sharper recognition of this particular pattern should you encounter it again in future relationships, protecting you from repeating the same painful confusion and the same painful self-blame. And it offers, perhaps most significantly, genuine compassion, both for yourself and for anyone navigating this particular internal architecture. Compassion that does not require abandoning your own boundaries or your own genuine needs in order to remain fully intact. Let's talk about what happens specifically to your own nervous system once this accurate understanding genuinely settles in, replacing the earlier, more painful narrative about diminished attraction. Many people report a noticeable physical shift, a release of tension previously held in the chest or stomach whenever memories of the withdrawal resurfaced, tension that often stemmed directly from the self-blaming interpretation rather than from the withdrawal itself. Replacing that interpretation with accurate understanding frequently produces genuine physiological relief, evidence that how we understand a painful experience shapes our embodied relationship to that experience nearly as significantly as the experience itself. Let's talk about what it means to communicate this understanding to trusted friends or family who may have witnessed your confusion and your pain throughout the relationship's more difficult periods. People who may have offered their own theories, sometimes helpful, sometimes inadvertently reinforcing the very narrative this discussion has worked to dismantle. Sharing this more accurate framework with people close to you can help correct any lingering misconceptions within your own support system, ensuring that the people offering you comfort and perspective are working from genuinely accurate understanding rather than from oversimplified assumptions about fading attraction. Let's talk about the specific danger of swinging too far in the opposite direction, becoming so committed to this framework that any future withdrawal from this person or from anyone else automatically gets explained away entirely through this same lens regardless of whether it genuinely applies. This framework offers valuable, accurate understanding for withdrawal specifically following moments of increasing intimacy within genuinely avoidant psychological patterns. It does not explain every instance of relational distance, and maintaining healthy discernment, evaluating each specific situation on its own merits rather than applying this framework universally and uncritically, protects against both the original error of unnecessary self-blame and a new error of excessive, unwarranted excuse-making. Let's talk, one final time, about what genuine peace looks like once this entire understanding has been fully integrated into your own self-perception. This peace does not require the relationship to resolve in any particular direction. It does not require them to ever explicitly acknowledge or articulate the mechanism described throughout this discussion. It simply requires your own settled confidence that whatever happened because of their own internal architecture rather than because of anything genuinely lacking within you. Confidence that remains fully intact regardless of whatever this specific relationship ultimately becomes. Let's talk about what this understanding means for how you might approach future intimacy in your own life, whether within this relationship or within whatever connection eventually follows it. Knowing that closeness itself can trigger fear in another person, regardless of your own genuine desirability, allows you to offer intimacy without carrying the full weight of responsibility for how that intimacy gets received. You can continue offering warmth, Continue allowing genuine vulnerability while holding realistic expectations about what any particular partner's nervous system is currently capable of tolerating, protecting your own self worth from becoming entangled with outcomes that were never fully within your control to determine. Let's talk about the specific courage required to continue believing in your own worth and your own capacity for genuine connection, even after navigating confusion this significant. Many people, after experiencing this particular kind of withdrawal without understanding its true mechanism, develop lasting caution around vulnerability itself, mistakenly concluding that closeness inevitably produces rejection. Understanding the accurate mechanism protects against this broader, more damaging conclusion, allowing you to continue pursuing genuine intimacy in future relationships with considerably more accurate expectations, rather than generalized fear born from misunderstanding what actually occurred within this specific situation. Let's talk about what it means to hold this understanding as a permanent tool available to you, not just for processing this particular relationship, but for interpreting relational confusion accurately whenever it arises in the future. The next time someone pulls away shortly after a genuinely close or vulnerable moment, you now possess the framework to ask a more accurate question than simply wondering what you did wrong. You can ask instead whether this pattern reflects their own relationship with closeness itself, a question that protects your own self-esteem while still allowing genuine compassion for whatever internal struggle the other person happens to be navigating. Let's talk about the specific relief available in finally releasing months, sometimes years of quiet self-questioning, replacing that questioning with genuine clarity about what actually occurred and why. This relief does not undo the pain already experienced, but it does prevent that pain from continuing to compound through ongoing, inaccurate self blame, allowing your healing to proceed from a foundation of truth rather than from a foundation of misunderstanding that never actually reflected what happened between you. Let's talk about what it means to extend this same accurate understanding toward how you evaluate your own past relationships, more broadly, revisiting earlier connections where similar confusion might have left lingering, inaccurate conclusions about your own desirability or your own worth. If a pattern of withdrawal following intimacy appeared more than once across different relationships, this repetition itself offers additional confirmation that the mechanism described throughout this discussion, rather than anything specific to any single relationship, likely explains what you experienced. Recognizing this broader pattern across your own relational history can provide considerable additional relief, replacing scattered self-doubt accumulated across multiple situations with a single, coherent, accurate understanding that applies consistently across all of them. Let's talk, finally, about what it means to move forward carrying this understanding, not as a defense against future vulnerability, but as genuine wisdom that makes future vulnerability considerably safer to offer. Knowing that withdrawal following closeness reflects the other person's internal architecture, rather than your own inadequacy, allows you to continue opening yourself to genuine intimacy without the same fear of self-blame that may have shadowed your earlier experiences. This wisdom, hard-won through considerable confusion and considerable reflection, becomes a permanent resource, protecting your self-worth while still leaving your heart genuinely open to whatever authentic connection eventually proves capable of matching the depth you have to offer. This is the understanding worth carrying forward above all else. And so, if you have spent considerable time believing that your own attractiveness or your own worth somehow diminished in their eyes, prompting their withdrawal, I want you to release that belief fully and completely. Their pulling away reflected an old, deeply conditioned fear of closeness itself, a fear that activates in response to intimacy, regardless of how genuinely desirable or how genuinely valuable the person creating that intimacy actually is. You did not lose their attraction. You likely triggered, simply through genuine closeness, an alarm system built long before you ever entered their life. And understanding this distinction fully and completely represents one of the most liberating realizations available to you throughout this entire healing process.